the mission of the Alliance is to support and defend community choice and other local clean energy developments that advance local clean energy for the environmental, economic, and social justice benefits of our communities. And that is something we take very seriously and have been working on for some time and will continue to focus on in sessions like this. So thank you for joining us this month. Our topic is barriers to microgrid deployment, or as I like to think of it, if we are ever going to be able to scale renewable energy in the decentralized, locally controlled power system that we so urgently need, these are the issues and the barriers that we have to fix. So our plan for the hour goes like this. We're going to start with a presentation by Allie Detrio. No stranger to this audience. Allie is the Chief Strategy Officer for Reimagine Power, a public policy think tank and consultancy that represents many of our voices and concerns in both the regulatory and legislative discussions that are underway around us right now. So Allie is going to be delving into a discussion of the most common and most fundamental barriers confronting the deployment of community microgrids as differentiated from single customer microgrids. Allie will also be drawing on a soon to be released study of the experience of the community microgrids around the state that have been funded by the CEC, California Energy Commission. And so we are most pleased and grateful to have this preview of the report, which is likely to kick off a broader discussion about what microgrids need in order to scale as widely and rapidly as we need. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Allie Detrio, who is sharing her slides.
So thanks everybody for joining. As Erica said, I am the Chief Strategist for Reimagine Power. And just the quickest, shameless introduction of our firm. We are a boutique consulting firm specialized in microgrids, advanced energy, technology, resiliency, and sustainability policy. We're here in San Francisco, strategically located so I can get to Sacramento and the PUC and to the airport down to SoCal to see you guys. We currently have a team of 5 and a number of different clients, including microgrid and clean energy developers. Many of you know me as the senior advisor and West Coast advocate for the Microgrid Resources Coalition, which is the national trade association for microgrids across the country. And I have a number of other clients in the clean energy space that I'm really proud to work with on so many key issues that are related and hopefully advancing community choice and community empowerment in California. So I want to kick off by talking about microgrids and just make sure that everyone understands what they are. Microgrids are considered to be a group of interconnected distributed energy resources that have the ability to both island from the grid at a single point and operate autonomously through self-generation, storage, and load shedding. So the important thing about microgrids, I really think, is that this is a graphic from the Climate Center, but I think they do a great job of depicting that microgrids are clean, affordable, reliable, equitable, and safe. And I think that it's really key that we start deploying a lot more microgrids, not just at individual facilities across the state, which is allowed through our traditional net energy metering tariff. And we're really trying hard to get a more robust microgrid tariff developed that can properly value and compensate all the different services that microgrids can provide, but also, leverage economies of scale and deploy microgrids at a community scale. So thinking about neighborhood blocks or even just connecting multiple customers together. And that's really a key barrier facing microgrids, not just in California, but across the country. So just a reminder about microgrids and where they came from in California. SB 1339 is the landmark microgrid legislation passed by Senator Stern in 2018. And I had the privilege of working closely with him on this bill back in 2018 and was actually part of the small team that really led the passage of this bill and was in the Capitol when it actually passed and signed into law. So it was really exciting. And so Microgrids here are defined by SB 1339. I don't need to read this definition for you as it's pretty straightforward, but just wanted to call out the legislation and, just where microgrids have really, microgrid policies really stemmed from since 2018. There's been a lot of history on microgrid policy over the last couple of years. I'm not going to read this slide, but there's a few things I just wanted to call out. One was that, we passed this bill in 2018, as many of you know, and then we had the Camp Fire that really devastated the town of Paradise, and I think really shone a spotlight on utility negligence and, deferred maintenance that should have been done over, many decades that really hasn't been, which led to PG&E declaring bankruptcy, and PSPS events started soon after in Q2 2019. It really wasn't until Q4 of 2019 that they really started being devastating to communities, and that they were causing power outages up and down the state for sometimes days at a time. And I'd say that that is the pivotal moment right after they opened the microgrid proceeding and we had all of those devastating power outages, that microgrids have really exploded in California, and the interest in resiliency solutions and community-driven resilience in particular has really become a huge priority for us. So I'm really glad that we've made some progress. As you can see, we have made some progress on microgrids since that time, but I would say it's been largely driven and corrupted by the utilities and their desire to own and control microgrids, not let communities deploy the resources that they want and need to serve their needs. And really, they've been obstructionists through this entire process. So we're into, about to be Q2 2022. We still don't have a microgrid tariff, not a real one that's robust anyway. And we don't have a way for communities to really build microgrids that serve multiple customers yet, although that is scoped for the second half of 2022 at the PUC. And I'm really hopeful that we actually can make some progress here in the next couple months on community microgrid deployment in California. But with all of that said, I wanted to highlight first what is allowed today, and then talk about some of the experiences that the CEC grantees through their Advanced Energy Community Program and some other just more general microgrid grants, which actually started being issued back in the early 2010s. And talk about some of these experiences and how that's kind of shaped where we're at today, which is really trying to formulate some concrete policy recommendations for the state on community microgrids so that we can all deploy microgrids quickly, easily, cost effectively, and in an equitable manner, really prioritizing community needs and those of disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. So this is an example of microgrids that are allowed today, which is the fire station microgrids, the city of Fremont. Essentially, these are great projects. They're essentially solar and battery storage projects with some controls that allow for more optimized DER deployment, exporting power to the grid when it's needed, but also displacing diesel generation and extending those fuel reserves in an emergency. So really deploying solar and batteries and these smart controls and software has really allowed the fire station to not rely on diesel generation except as a redundancy measure or for a super long duration power outage, where solar and batteries are good for shorter duration power outages. So something that's under 4 hours typically, and there's even some batteries that are now going up to 8 hours in duration. So we really are making a lot of progress in long duration energy storage, but just as a technical limitation, they do not provide indefinite resilience. They provide the shorter duration resilience, but that's still incredibly important. It helps really reduce our carbon emissions. It helps with carbon emissions. It also helps with just really looking to extend and firm our renewable output. So there's been a number of single customer microgrids deployed at fire stations in Fremont. And I think this is a great example of what microgrids are capable of doing in communities and providing that power. Ultimately, this is a more simplistic microgrid design. They serve individual facilities. They're not crossing rights of way or attempting to serve multiple customers or even really integrate multiple generating resources. It's really just solar and batteries, and then they hook up the diesel generator if they think that they're going to go beyond a power outage of 4 to 6 hours. So this is what's allowed today, and this is interconnected generally under a net metering tariff, which doesn't allow for more of the locational benefits and more of the advanced grid services that this project is capable of providing, because the tariff does not properly account for any of those additional services. So one of the reasons why we need a more robust microgrid tariff is to really account for all of the values that these types of microgrids can provide to the grid and provide compensation for them. But getting into the heart of community microgrid challenges that we're facing, I think a great example of this, of a community microgrid project, is the Oakland Eco Block. This has been a 2-phase CEC project. You can see that it's looking to deploy an all-electric microgrid and deep energy efficiency and water efficiency retrofits to a low-income underserved community. And really the initial vision of this project was to really help provide affordable, clean energy to lower and middle income neighborhoods, but also experiment with how do we leverage these economies of scale by interconnecting a block of homes and really optimizing all of these resources for not just the benefit of one customer, but the entire community. And so it's the vision of this project is really innovative and cutting edge. And so here's essentially the graphical element of this project. One thing I really want to call out is this is the original vision of the microgrid project. It had a DC microgrid infrastructure that was all going to be connected underground. They were going to get rid of the radial poles and wires that PG&E wouldn't upgrade for a long time, have shared electric vehicle charging, intelligent loads and demand response with the appliances, a community energy storage system, and rooftop solar that is optimized for the entire community, even though you can see that different rooftops have different amounts of solar that can be produced. But the most important thing is this project was envisioning, connecting all of these homes and facilities behind a single interconnection with PG&E. So they would only pay for power imports at one location. All the resources would be optimized. And really the goal is to, self-supply clean energy, optimize the resources for the community, and hopefully rely on the utility a lot less. That was the original vision for the Eco Block model. And unfortunately, a lot of this design got thrown out because our policies and regulations have not been updated since the 50s, and the utilities have really sought to obstruct this project because they see it as a threat to their utility business model, and even letting the camel's nose under the tent a little bit by letting this pilot project go forward would have set a precedent that they're afraid of. And so unfortunately, what happened with this project, before I move on to the next one, is that PG&E said that this project was in violation of Public Utilities Code 218, which is our over the fence rule, which I'll get into in a moment, but essentially requires if you are an entity that's looking to distribute power to more than 2 properties or across a public street, you would be considered an electrical corporation subject to public utility regulation, which is very onerous and time consuming and expensive. So there's a provision that actually says that you're not an electrical corporation if you're developing microgrids or you're developing energy resources for your own use. And so the Eco Block team went through a big legal challenge with the PG&E, the CPUC, and the Energy Commission, and said, look, we think we should be exempt under this own use provision. And essentially the CPUC did not allow this project to move forward. They would not make an official determination in the track 2 of the microgrid proceeding that says own use is definitively not an electrical corporation. They remained silent on the issue, despite the mayor of Oakland, the UC Berkeley team, and the entire Eco Block legal team sending letters and having lots of meetings about this. Ultimately, what has happened is PG&E is forcing this community to interconnect under their community microgrid enablement program, which went through no scrutiny, and the Microgrid Resources Coalition opposed the creation of this program without robust stakeholder input, of which it had none, and ultimately are making this community do individual interconnection applications. There's no DC microgrid infrastructure. They're going to be using existing PG&E poles and wires that all have to be upgraded. The cost is being borne by the project. And they're essentially doing, they can only island at the discretion of the utility, and they still have to pay for power while in island mode. So it was ultimately, this vision was not realized, and instead EcoBlock was forced to be using, a PG&E construct that is only beneficial to them and really gets away from the true spirit of the CEC pilots, as well as, really just not doing anything beneficial for the community. So it's been a really big slog for this project. Now we're really excited that it's finally moving forward, but it really ended up having to do a suboptimal microgrid design because our policies and regulations do not clearly exempt community microgrids from the definition of an electrical corporation. And really the PUC did not provide any sort of support and say, hey, this is an innovative pilot. We need it to go forward as originally envisioned by the Energy Commission. So it's kind of a bummer, but this was the original vision. And I would say that this vision is still what we're really pushing for. We need to get our policies and regulations to be updated to account for this vision and allow it to move forward, because there's a lot of benefits that can be provided by a microgrid of this type of design. Another project that went through a similar pain is the Lancaster Advanced Energy Community, where they were originally going to create a Lancaster Green District program, a residential microgrid, and a community resilience center at some of the schools. And they were trying to interconnect under a different pathway. Instead of using the own use exemption, what Lancaster tried to do was say, we want to create a master metered community design, essentially looking just like this, where they would have one main point of interconnection with the utility, in this case, Southern California Edison. We're going to have sub meters on each of the homes, but ultimately one master meter is going to be interconnected with Edison. And we're going to make sure that these are all contiguous properties, so there's no crossing of streets, and making sure that we can build the residential microgrid design under a master meter configuration. And Southern California Edison said no, because we have utility regulations, which are under the purview of the CPUC, which essentially say that you are not allowed to supply power to one premise and then transmit or distribute that power to another premise. It's called Electric Rule 18 and 19, essentially prohibits master metering and sub metering. And the reasons for that are essentially the utility claims that there are safety and reliability issues. Although it is something that's done effectively and safely in campuses and other single customer multi-facility configurations all the time. It's a very straightforward design application. So Lancaster has pursued an exemption of Rule 18, where they are now they are allowed now through the Track 2 decision at the CPUC on the microgrid proceeding to transmit power from a critical facility to an adjacent premise only during an outage. And the utility is requiring a lot of expensive equipment to make that happen, and basically prohibiting the sharing of power between facilities in blue sky conditions, which severely limits the energy efficiency, demand response, and community optimization opportunities that would have been provided by this microgrid. Now, this project is still, quite frankly, in a lot of these litigation stages right now. It has not been built yet, and it's unclear whether or not Southern California Edison will throw up more barriers, but they have essentially been a thorn in the Lancaster side from the beginning, refused to help with the project in any sort of way, and have essentially just been barriers in the negotiating process, falling back on Section 218 and Rule 18 as their barriers to progress. So this project, instead of having a really optimal residential microgrid design, is doing some really cool things, but ultimately they are not able to realize the initial vision that they had with this microgrid. So again, Public Utilities Code 218, it defines what is and is not an electrical corporation. One thing that's really interesting about this law is that there have been multiple exemptions given over the years. This was originally written in 1951. That's how long this law has been written and in effect. And then there was an exemption for cogeneration back in 1984. And then they added an independent solar energy producer exemption back in 2008 to clarify that an individual customer that enters into a power purchase agreement or a solar lease for, solar or other generation in their home would not be considered an electrical corporation. So that tells me that there is a pathway to changing this law, as it has been done several times. And the natural order of, technology progression and policy progression would be to say that community microgrids, where, power is being generated, stored, and consumed on a community level, should be exempt from the definition of electrical corporation, should not be subject to utility CPUC regulation, and should not require communities to become public utilities in order to develop these types of projects. So in order to change this, we need either a bill or a ballot initiative, because it requires policy change. It requires law change to actually enable this to happen. Now, one other project that's really interesting that I wanted to bring everyone's attention is the Blue Lake Rancheria, which is a tribal community up in Humboldt County that also was looking to do a community microgrid. And they had 7 buildings that they decided they were going to optimize in the form of a community microgrid. And because this is a tribal government with authority that supersedes that of even the state of California, they were able to not only create a microgrid that served their needs, but they were able to interconnect multiple buildings, and even went so far as to purchase the end of the distribution infrastructure from PG&E, so they could reconfigure the wires and the poles to create a new point of common coupling with the grid and integrate all of their buildings behind one single electrical meter. And they basically import power through one basic E19 commercial rate and export from PG to PG&E when needed. So that shows that this is technically possible, and it's possible from a regulatory standpoint, but that they only did this because the tribe has authority that supersedes that of the state. And so ultimately, this is the ideal community microgrid design framework. Again, you have one single point of common coupling with the utility grid, one big master meter that's able to record imports and record exports and provide compensation for any sort of export of power or other services like grid services, ancillary services, capacity, et cetera. And behind that single point of common coupling, there may be a multitude of generating and storage resources and energy efficiency and demand response, but that they are all able to be optimized for the benefit of the community and the facilities, which allows you to have some very deep energy efficiency gains. It allows you to use power on site and purchase a lot less from the utility, as well as providing you with the clean energy and decarbonization, as well as the resiliency benefits that communities are increasingly looking at now that power outages are becoming such a common theme in California. So again, what Blue Lake Rancheria is doing is essentially the ideal community microgrid design framework that we want to empower other communities like EcoBlock, like Lancaster, and like many others up and down the state to be able to do. And so with that, we've got a couple key policy recommendations that, I've been thinking on this for a number of years now, after learning and really understanding in extreme depth all of the CEC project experiences and the pain that they all went through with the utility and all the design and implementation concessions that had to be made because of our outdated policies and regulations not keeping pace with either the technology and what is safe and reliable and able to be done today, as well as addressing the needs of communities and those that are clearly saying that they want these clean energy technologies and the resilience and the community empowerment benefits, allowing them to own and control energy assets. We've come up with a few policy recommendations that will be outlined in a lot greater detail in a report that will be released sometime in the late spring or early summer in a more official manner. So this is a preview kind of what that report will talk about. But essentially, we've centered around a few key recommendations that policy recommendations that will really help empower community microgrids. The first one is changing Public Utilities Code 218 to clearly exempt microgrids that are owned and controlled by communities, whether that's done under the own use exemption, or we write a new section of code that says microgrids are not electrical corporations. I frankly don't care, as long as we get the law changed to clearly exempt you guys from the public utility regulation and allow for communities to build microgrids. The second thing that we want to do, and this is giving an olive branch to the commission, so to speak, is to create a community microgrid operator designation and regulatory framework. Essentially, many of you guys know electric service providers, or ESPs. They are allowed to provide direct access to certain commercial and industrial customers. Similarly, they have a load serving entity role similar to the CCAs. And what they have to do is register with the commission and have, basically a light touch regulatory framework that they have to follow in order to serve commercial and industrial customers with direct access. This community microgrid operator designation is modeled off of that. Essentially, we're saying that, anyone that wants to develop and operate a community microgrid, so some of my clients that are in the microgrid developer space would have to register, provide a safety certificate, and probably some other things showing that they are meeting our decarbonization, reliability, equity, and safety priorities, but essentially allow them to register with the commission. And then they should be allowed to develop microgrids through master metering in the design configuration that I just mentioned before. So allow them to develop microgrids that cross public rights of way and that serve multiple customers. And if we do that, that means you now have a project partner. The community now has a project partner that could help them with building, owning, maintaining, and operating the microgrid in the best possible way for the community, for resilience, for decarbonization, for affordability, and really put the control back in the hands of the community. Because unlike the utility, who just has a whole bunch of captive customers, microgrid developers are trying to help realize the vision of the communities. We serve the communities, not the other way around. So that is a really important policy recommendation that we think is going to be key at the commission in terms of, not just saying we want deregulation and everyone should just be able to do whatever the hell they want. We're trying to come up with a framework that still puts the public interest, still prioritizes the public interest and, gives the regulator a role in all of this as well. And then after that, we believe that the commission should develop tariffs and rates that really promote electron sharing between neighbors, helping to prioritize the optimization of clean energy resources locally, instead of us having to rely on long distance transmission and centralized gas plants that harm disadvantaged communities. And then finally, we want to create more streamlined interconnection procedures that help ease the development, application, administration burden for communities that are looking to develop microgrids. So these 5 recommendations, I think, are really key to unlocking the full value and promise of community microgrids in California. So we can really get to a place where, the community has all of these resources available at its disposal. It's able to share that with community members, and we're ultimately able to achieve our decarbonization, equity, resilience, and sustainability goals as a state. And so with that, I'm going to pause here and start taking questions from the group. But I want to just thank everybody for your time and for listening today.
Allie, you have quite a topic here, and it's just wonderful to hear you expound on it. Thank you all for coming. See you next month.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Amazing presentation.
Great job, Allie.
Excellent
Great job.
presentation.
Thank you.